The next big question is how the replication of genes created human psychology. That brings us to evolutionary psychology. A thought is an electrical signal that's transmitted through your brain. Human behavior is the result of chemical and electrical signals being transmitted from your body to your brain, then through your brain, then back out to your body. That pattern of signals results in you keeping yourself alive, having children, keeping them alive, and making more copies of your genes. But how can we talk about thoughts in terms of biochemical electrical signals? We need a new perspective, and that's what evolutionary psychology is. The first principle of evolutionary psychology is all human behavior is the product of the attempt by the individual to preserve the survival of his or her genes by the most effective means perceivable to him or her. With one rather complicated sentence, you have identified everyone's goals for every action they ever take in life. How the Mind Works by Dr. Steven Pinker is a very thorough introduction to evolutionary psychology. The Moral Animal by WRIGHT is a more philosophical introduction to the concept. The easiest way to think of it is, everyone always does the best they can to try to provide for their needs, according to their own interpretation of their best and their needs. In other words, my grandmother figured it out intuitively roughly 75 years ago. She just didn't have any way of tracing it down to molecular biology or the origin of our species. Theater artists have also figured it out by building upon the work of Konstantin Stanislavski from the 1920s and 30s, and I've worked in and around professional theater for about 15 years. You also learn a lot about psychology training as a pilot and then as a flight instructor. Teaching obviously involves a lot of psychology. Piloting requires you to learn a lot about psychology because there are a lot of ways you can get misleading sensory input while you're flying, so that if you react to what you feel the aircraft is doing, you won't react appropriately for what the aircraft is actually doing. Those are called sensory illusions. Pilot error is the leading cause of aviation accidents by far. We all train to ignore our feelings and trust our eyes in order to get the reliable information we need to fly safely. Some pioneers of evolutionary psychology, like Dr. Wilson, have observed that the study of evolutionary psychology has a lot of potential for illuminating problems in the study of science itself. This is what I mean by the difference between learning how to think objectively and learning how to think objectively under imminent threat of death. Richard Dawkins writes a lot of books about the importance of thinking objectively, and he's off to a good start. But I'm willing to bet that at no time in his career has he ever been in a situation where he had to interpret evidence correctly or else he would die within 5 seconds. Well, I train to do that for a living. Now, as far as I can tell, the science industry in America has been taken over by a bunch of sheltered rich white people who think they have all the time in the world to spend thinking about stuff and debating stuff, while men and women are dying to defend your freedom to an education. And it never even occurred to you that maybe you should put your education to use in a way that would do us some good. So come on, all you scientific geniuses out there. Let's think about this objectively. If the only choice you're giving me is to risk my life to defend your freedom to an education, and you not putting your work to use in a way that's going to benefit me, or not risking my life to defend your freedom to an education and you not putting your work to use in a way that's going to benefit me, I'm going to pick the one that I think will maximize the survival rate of my genes. And the choice is obvious. Now you write book after book about why people should learn more about science, but if the example you're setting makes it look to the public that people who learn about science turn into parasites, how on earth do you plan on winning public support that way? Now, I don't want anybody to misunderstand what I'm saying here. I don't want to get lumped in with all those people who criticize Richard Dawkins and his fans for being too objective. No, I'm criticizing them for not being objective enough. Evolutionary psychology gets really complicated really fast. The basic outline goes like this. Once upon a time, change and variation in a gene gave a microscopic worm a skin cell that was sensitive to light. That worm acted differently when its light-sensitive cell was getting hit by light than it did when it wasn't getting hit by light. The worm didn't need to know what it was doing or why it was doing it. It just did it. And as a result of doing it, it survived and reproduced better than the other members of the species and passed more of its genes on to future generations. Now you have a more intelligent worm, because this worm is better able to process information. The worm's sensory input triggers physical output that results in photoreceptive cells being passed on to some of its offspring. The pattern creates more patterns. Now fast forward to the southern tip of Africa about 7 million years ago. Dr. Ehrlich tells this part of the story in his book, Human Natures. A species of primate lived in the forest there. When the forest got overcrowded, either by the forest shrinking or the population expanding, some of those primates wandered out into the grassland. They already had hands and arms that were well adapted for grabbing branches as they climbed around in the trees. Out in the grassland, standing upright let those primates see predators approaching over the top of the grass. That made the ones who stood upright the most successful at passing their genes on to the next generation. Eventually, all the primates who walked on all fours got eaten, so their genes died out. So that species of primate became the only mammal in the world to walk on 2 feet. Now that those primates had hands that were good at grabbing things and didn't need their hands for walking anymore, they started using more tools. They could use clubs to help them kill other animals. They could use sharp rocks to cut through the hides of their prey, and so on, rather than depending entirely on parts of their own bodies to do those things. But doing that also depended on their being able to recognize patterns of cause and effect that would make those things happen. These were social animals, like all primates, who lived in groups for their mutual protection, but who competed against each other for mates. Eventually, these tool-using primates got smarter than every other species in the world, but they were still competing against each other for mates. People kept getting smarter because the ones who could best perceive patterns of cause and effect and anticipate the decisions other people were going to make were the ones who were the most successful at surviving and reproducing in the group.